Okay.
Great. Well, good morning again, everybody. I am Mayor Schulman with the Hartford Foundation's Nonprofit Support Program, and I want to welcome you all to today's session on succession and sustainability planning. As always, a big thank you to my terrific NSP teammates, Monica Kelly and Betsy Johnson, for all of their behind-the-scenes assistance and great teamwork in planning and managing today's session and so many of the sessions that we do. And since it's a question that always comes up, we will be sharing the session recording and the slides with all of you following today's session. Betsy will also be posting the survey for this session in the chat towards the end, and she will also be sending you the survey in an email immediately following the session. The survey is the only price of admission, as we always say, and we really do value your feedback. So please take just a couple of minutes and fill out that survey after the session. I did want to mention that the Nonprofit Support Program offers executive transition grants that can cover consulting costs associated with an executive director or a CEO transition. So if that program is of interest to you now or at some point down the road, please do feel free to reach out to me. Our presenter today, Frank, will be pausing at several points to take questions. So please, as we go, jot your questions down and enter them in the chat. And we will try to get to as many or hopefully all of them as we go through the session. We also recognize that sometimes there can be sensitive issues around a topic like executive transition. So if you prefer to ask a question anonymously, that's perfectly fine. Just send it to me through the chat as a private message, and then I'll ask the question to Frank anonymously. So you do have that option. Frank will be sticking around immediately following today's session for what we call after class time. So if there are questions that we can't get to during the session, you'll have another kind of more intimate opportunity right after we end to ask any lingering questions. And I'm delighted that our presenter today is Frank Abdale, who is founder and chief consultant of Abdale Consulting, which specializes in strategic and business planning, succession planning, fund development, board development, and many other things. Frank has worked previously with the Nonprofit Support Program on a similar workshop and on several of our learning opportunities for nonprofits as well as consultants. So that's it for me. And Frank, I will turn the program over to you.
Great. Well, thank you, Mayor, and thank you for the opportunity to be here. And thanks, everybody, for spending your time with us this morning. This is great. I'm not going to go through this bio. Just want to say that, my experience with succession planning is pretty well-rounded. I've seen it as an executive director myself. I've seen it as a staff member. I've seen it as a board member, as well as it being part of my consulting practice. So jumping in, just talking about today's session, we are going to ask people to stay muted unless there's a question that you want to ask. We're going to ask you to respond to various things in a chat or in a poll. As Mayor mentioned, as we go through various sections of today's workshop, we're going to pause to give you a chance to ask questions as we go along. As Mayor mentioned, the slides are going to be sent afterwards, along with some other resources, which we'll talk about, and that the session's being recorded. So I just want to make sure that everyone's familiar with the various functions on Zoom, that you know how to mute, unmute, you know how to use the chat. We don't want to assume that everybody has the same capacity. So just quickly in the chat, any concerns or issues about being able to participate based on your knowledge of the technology here? Okay, well, seeing none, let's move on. And it's always helpful, I think, whenever we come together as a community to have some agreements for what will promote a safe space as well as civil discourse. So some of the things, I've pre-populated this just in the interest of time, is that we agree, all of us agree to be present and to participate. That when you do ask a question or share a comment, that we mind our airtime, knowing that there's not a lot of time and there's a lot of folks here. Avoiding cross-talking, using I statements, I think, I feel, rather than you said, that when we hear something that we may be different from our own perspective, that we listen respectfully. And particularly if we don't agree with what someone's saying, to the degree that we can, that we assume best intentions. And as Mayor mentioned, there may be some sensitive issues that people want to talk about or ask questions about. So we all agree to maintain confidentiality, that what we hear here stays here, but also what we learn here leaves here. And anything else that would contribute to making this feel like a safe space for folks. You can put something in the chat if you like. If we were in person, I might be asking you, how do we, in today's world, this is about emotional safety, but also in a physical space, what's our physical safety issues around masks or distance and things. So anything anyone wants to add to this before we move on? Okay, so let's talk about why we're here. What it is that we want to accomplish today. So we want to look at succession planning, and we really want to look at an expanded definition of it. Usually when we talk about succession planning, it's usually people go immediately to an executive director or a CEO transition, which is a lot of what this is about. But there's also different kinds of succession planning scenarios. So we want to talk about this as a board responsibility, as well as a staff responsibility. If you have challenges with this or questions, please feel free to bring them. This is a great forum to talk about this. And we want to look at some of the critical questions, opportunities, challenges you would find in a successful executive transition. But we're all going to talk about staff leadership, board leadership, and emergency succession planning. And we also want to tap into your experience and your wisdom here, because let's not assume I'm the only person who knows anything about this, that you all have experience of some sort. And it may bring, if someone raises a question and my answer may have something that doesn't include your experience, please feel free to jump in. We have the hand raise, we have the chat. And then finally, we're going to talk about identifying resources. So there'll be a whole list of resources that you'll get after this, as well as the slide deck. But if there are things that you want to see more of, that can be in the survey that you get afterwards. And all of the resources that we share will be posted on the Foundation's website for you. So various templates and tools. So any questions about our goals for today? Okay, just want to make sure that everyone is in the right room and that these goals are going to meet your expectations. Okay, so we mentioned resources. So we're going to circle back to this at the very end, but as I go through the presentation today, we'll mention where there are resources that we're going to be sharing. But if you want to see a sample of something that we mentioned, you can plug that into the chat. And if it's not in our list of resources, we'll see what we can add. So why are you here? What brought you here? What would you like to take home from this? Maybe you can just start answering that in the chat. So briefly, what would you like to take home today? What brought you here? And while you're doing that, I'm just going to run through why we do succession planning. Why? Now, I mean, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes energy, but it is a best practice for the board or the staff. This culture of continual improvement, it's when you think about building pipelines for staff leadership or board leadership, you're constantly looking at how you can learn and improve, and how you learn, how you help the people you already have learn and improve, and what you need to bring in order to continue to improve as an organization. It can certainly help ensure resilience, sustainability, manage risks. Life happens. and things happen to people, and it helps to be prepared. It's the old Boy Scout in me, be prepared. Certainly it can inform your development and budgeting processes when you think about staff development, when you think about anticipating a transition at a CEO level and what that's going to cost in terms of finding headhunters or search, or it can get expensive hiring consultants. And it also ultimately it informs your recruitment and your development efforts. But more to come on that. Just take a quick look at the chat. Someone's going to be leaving, and older board of directors. You want to update existing plans. Understanding the board's role in this. 4 key staff in their 60s. Not a lot of people in the pipeline, not unusual. Ensuring that you're in good hands. Okay. So I don't see anything here where there's any expectations that we need to manage. I think we're going to cover most of what's here. And again, I will answer any questions you have. And if we don't get to answer those questions here in the time that we have set aside for the workshop, I will be staying on afterwards to answer any questions. And also sometimes after a conversation like this, questions bubble up after the fact. So if after today, you're thinking, I should have asked this or that, I'm sure if you send the question to Mayor, she'd be happy to forward it to me, and I can get back to you. Okay. So we're going to look at various scenarios, starting with emergency succession planning, the executive transition, and that can be planned or unplanned, and that can have various iterations. We're going to talk about leadership development for staff, leadership development for the board. So starting our first poll here, which of these scenarios is of most interest to you? Monica is going to be taking your responses, sending out a poll. We'll get to see, this will help me certainly think about where to dig, maybe where to scan a little faster, but where to spend more time. Cool. Okay, this is great. So at least a full 50% of you are interested in executive transition, but a fair amount, 25% in staff development, board development, and a small group of folks interested in emergency succession plans. Okay, great. Well, why don't we jump in then, and we can start off with looking at the emergency succession plan. And again, only 7% of people are interested in this, but what an emergency succession plan does, it focuses mostly on that executive transition, which more than half of you are interested in. So it will identify the circumstances on which you activate the plan, clarify the board's role in an emergency. It defines the authority and restrictions of somebody who has to jump in. First of all, it tells you who's going to jump in and then define their authority. And it would also include the outline of a communications plan, because one of the things to consider in an emergency situation is, how do we talk about this? How do we let people know internally? How do we know externally? We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. So not to go through all of this, but some of the components are, where are the documents? Where are your key governance documents? Where's the financial information? Where's information about your stakeholders, HR, facilities, insurance, et cetera? And these are things that even, or I would argue, particularly in a small organization with not a lot of people, or with that situation where you have 4 people in their 60s who are primed to be moving on, where is all this information kept? It should be ideally in one central location. It's confidential, so not everybody may have access to this. Maybe your board secretary, certainly your board chair, your top staff. But this is really critical information, and the smaller you are, the more likely that all this information is concentrated into one or two people. So there's even more urgency to make sure that all of this information is documented somewhere. So just curious, how many people have an emergency succession plan in place currently? And the maybe is if you're not sure if you have one. But this is our next poll, and let's see what folks have said. Not seeing a poll. Okay. Not in depth. Okay. All right. If you don't know, that's fine, but I would encourage you to find out. Okay. All right, so maybe 25% do have one. More than half don't, and a fair number aren't sure. So I would really encourage you as a next step to think about this. One of the things that we will share in resources is we'll share a template for this. So you don't have to make this up. You don't have to reinvent any wheels here. So we will share an emergency succession plan template with everybody afterwards. Okay, great to know. And so let's talk about, I'm sorry. Do we have any questions about emergency succession planning before we move on? You can unmute and jump in, or you can put a question in the chat. Okay, hearing none, we can move on. So when we think about succession planning for the board, the first thing we think about is creating a pipeline. And how do we do that? So that there is some bench strength being developed as you move along. So first things first is, how do you recruit people? What's your process for identifying, cultivating, engaging, orienting, maintaining, deploying, improving your board members? So there's a whole looking at that strategy, which is based in part on things like having a strategic plan in place and understanding where you expect the organization to go in the future. Strategic planning is another workshop, but certainly thinking about what's your plan for the future, and then how does that inform your efforts to bring in and use the board members you have. Once you have board members, you can use your committee structure of standing committees or ad hoc or task forces, where you can give people an opportunity to take a leadership role, maybe chair a committee or co-chair. Maybe you take someone who's relatively new and someone very experienced and have them co-chair a committee or a task force. That gives you a chance to see people showing up, how they show up. Can they run a meeting? Can they meet deadlines? Do they set goals? What are the goals for these committees? Again, going back to what your strategic plan is. Term limits. This continues to be a somewhat controversial topic. There are some schools of thought that feel like if you have term limits, even extended ones, let's say three-year terms, and then that person has to cycle off the board, there's often a fear that we don't have a lot of board members. If we lose them, then what do we do? So I just encourage people to think about, where does that come from? Is that a scarcity consciousness at play there? Is this that you're in a very under-resourced area, which could be true? Hartford's not that under-resourced. I mean, if you're dealing with organizations in maybe Tulsa or Topeka, trying to think of some small communities I've worked in, El Paso, that they may not be as well resourced as an urban area like Hartford, but still, if there are term limits in place, it creates a culture in which there is a continual need to continually look for new board members and to bring new people on and to take the people you have and give them an opportunity to develop and to grow in leadership roles. And then there's always that ongoing education, always educating your board members, thinking about where and how and when do you do that? What do your board meetings look like? How much space is there for things like education to be brought to the board? All of these things bring people to a level where they can move up to leadership within the board. So, maybe somebody who comes in is coming in because they're good at something, but their financial literacy, particularly with nonprofit finances, is very limited. So one question you might ask as you think about the next year and you plan ahead for your board education program is, what is the financial literacy level of most of our board members? How familiar are our board members with the operating environment, with the regulation environment, depending on your kind of program, the kind of mission you have? So lots of opportunities to think about how you create a pipeline for leadership so that there are always people ready to step in. One of the biggest issues I've seen with boards is that when there's a vacuum of leadership potential, not always the right person steps up, or you hear, well, no one else wanted the job, so I'm the board chair. That's not a dynamic environment. I'm not saying that any of this is easy, but I am saying that it's important for the board to focus on this and making sure that they have created or in the process of creating a pipeline for themselves. Who's going to be responsible for this on the board? Very often it's the governance committee. Doesn't have to be, but it's often them. But somebody has to take responsibility for leading the effort, communicating with everybody on the board, responsible for board development. That annual evaluation is critical, that self-evaluation. As a collective, assessing the board collectively as a body, what's its impact, but also assessing the individual performance of every board members. And there's lots of ways to do that with like annual commitment letters or something that details the expectation that each board member will set for themselves for how they're going to perform during the year. And then every year there's an opportunity, not as a report card, but as a chance to have a conversation and sit down with each board member and say, so how are we doing for you? Are there things the board might ask of you that you have to give, but you're not being asked for? Are there issues or concerns you have with how things are going with the board? It's just a chance to connect and talk, but have something concrete to have to center that conversation. It's also the governance committee or nominating committee in a larger organization, a larger board, to prepare the slate of officers, be paying attention to terms and term limits. When I go into rooms with boards, I say, so how long have you people been on the board? People will say, gee, I don't remember. When did I join the board? It's like, this is something everyone should know. They should know when they join, how much time they have left on the board, and what kind of terms are in place. And term limits can be different for officers versus board members, that your officer rotation may be happening more frequently than your actual board members cycling off. But being aware, that's part of the education. Do people understand everything that's in the bylaws? How often do you review the bylaws with board members to make sure that everybody's up to speed? And then the ongoing education. And throughout all of this is an effort to ensure diversity, to bringing in, to creating a board that is reflective of the community that's being served, that is bringing in a wide range of experience and perspectives and training. So there's a lot to explore, particularly around diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Frank, there was a question in the chat about this very diversity issue. And so I just
Great.
wanted to mention very briefly a couple of resources. One is folks may or may not be familiar with a resource called Leaders on Board, which is a program of Leadership Greater Hartford. And they are a group that can help match nonprofits with folks that are interested in serving on boards. So we'll put the link in the chat for you, but that is one resource. The other thing we've seen a fair amount of is nonprofits developing DEI plans for their organizations as a whole. So it's really looking at all aspects of your organization, you know, your staffing, your board, the way you function, all of those things. So we can provide support if you're interested in bringing in a consultant to help you look at DEI more broadly in your organization. So just wanted to add those things, Frank.
Great. No, thank you. That's great and great to know. And in terms of a DEI statement for a board, absolutely, absolutely. And I would look at the resources that Mayor is going to share to see if there are samples of that. But if you don't find samples of that, you can let me know, and I can supply a couple. Great. Any other questions about board development before we move on? Okay. Oh, I see the link you put in the chat, Mayor. Great, thank you. Leaders on Board is an excellent resource from Anne. Terrific. Okay, so let's think about for staff for a minute. There are about 25% of the people here were interested in this. So why do you want to do this? You know, it's a way to attract talent, which is always a challenge. It ensures seamless operations, allows you to hire from within. Giving people the opportunity to learn and grow professionally is a way to contribute to retention, as well as satisfaction and productivity. And also the emergency succession plan, leadership development plan for the board and for the staff, all of these things are great ways to reassure your donors that you're protecting their investment. Because as a nonprofit, what we do is we make promises. We make promises to a community of people who need the services that we're offering. And we make promises to the people who are giving us money to allow us to do that. So that investment that's coming, whether it's a large grant from a foundation or a government contract or an individual, that investment is something that needs to be respected and protected. And leadership development at every level is a way to do that, and then to trumpet that to your donors. And it also maintains institutional memory, that history. It gets passed along from one person to the next. This costs money to do. And one of the things I found on a couple of boards, ones that I've served on, is that when budgets are tight, one of the first thing that gets cut from the line items is staff development. And but there are lots of ways to do that without spending a lot of money. So for example, cross-training. If you have one person who does a critical task, maybe they're the IT person and they're maintaining all of the client records, and they're the only person who knows how this works, this is in considerable jeopardy for the organization. So having someone who at least knows the basics of some of your critical operations is important. You can assign staff people if someone looks like a rising star or somebody you really like to develop, you know, include them in a special project, add them to a task force, include them in strategic planning, include them in thinking about you know, how they're going to help implement. I see a raised hand. I'll come back to that in just a second. You can offer staff the opportunity to join a coalition or to be part of your advocacy efforts or be on the board of another organization that's connected to you mission-wise, or let them be part of professional associations, pay their dues. The one thing I would suggest about this is that if you're going to pay for someone to be part of an association or part of a coalition, that you require them to be active within that they have to be on a committee. They have to demonstrate that not only do they just pay their dues, but they go to the conferences, that they serve on a committee, that they work on a task force, that they're involved. You can have staff members who are liaisons to various board committees. Then there's also training, education, special skills. And a big challenge is offering people competitive salaries. You know, it's hear it again and again in the nonprofit world that, you know, we can't afford to pay people, or there's even some expectation that because we're a nonprofit, we shouldn't be offering, we're not talking about hedge fund bonuses here, but we're talking about living wage. We're talking about making a living so people can support themselves and support anyone else that they're responsible. So we had one question. It was Kylie. What was the question?
Yeah, so this came up on a board actually that I sit on, not related to my organization, it's another state. On your prior slide, we were talking about hiring from within, particularly for leadership positions.
Mm-hmm.
As we've seen more and more nonprofits really centering racial equity and focusing on DEI, the question of whether it's appropriate to hire from within, especially in leadership positions, without doing a broader search and without creating the opportunity to for others, and whether, again, hiring from within sort of perpetuates some of the, I don't know, privilege might be the wrong word, but perpetuates that concept of getting a job from someone you know versus casting a wider net and incorporating new voices into the
Great
nonprofit
point.
leadership space.
Yeah.
So there's been some tension there in this group that I work with, and in looking at their existing leadership team and succession planning, where most of the leadership is all white and they're great leaders, right? But thinking about how do we better position this organization from a DEI standpoint moving forward.
Right. Okay, that's a great point, and thank you for bringing that up. I really appreciate that, because it does. Hiring from within will perpetuate an existing culture. And if you're looking to shift or expand or change culture within an organization, particularly if you're looking at all of your leadership, and it's primarily white, which is not unusual in the nonprofit world, you look at the people being served, and very often, or largely, we're talking about underserved populations. And then from that client base all the way up to the board, the higher you get, the wider it gets. This is throughout the nonprofit sector. So yeah, hiring from within can be a good thing, because you're developing somebody, you're bringing somebody along, and you're making sure that there's continuity in positions. But I wouldn't suggest that it's the only way to go about it. And then when we talk about the ED search, we're going to circle back to this and look at what the benefit is of expanding your search to external sources and thinking about where and how are you looking? Are you looking in the same old places? Are you looking in places that are going to cast a broader net and bring more diversity to your candidate pool? So there's a lot around that. So I appreciate you bringing it up, and definitely there can be tension about that, but it can also be a benefit. And it's I think on a case-by-case basis. And if you have somebody internally who is a good candidate for the position, you can combine them. You can encourage them to apply for the position and be considered along with a host of other external candidates. The challenge there is very often if someone's internal, they apply for the job, they don't get it, are they going to stay? Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. You know, sometimes they by applying for a position that's above what their current grade is, it sparks ambition, and that's something that you have to consider. But that happens, and there's not a lot we can do about that. But I do think that it's a great point, and more to come when we get to the executive transition section. Is that okay? Does that answer, Kylie?
Yes. Yeah, no, that's helpful. The situation you described is one we're encountering, whether we cast a net when we know there's an existing good candidate, and whether that is sort of just checking the box and putting the search out there when we know we have this person we like, and is that appropriate or fair and equitable versus not? And so all those questions are
Right.
churning,
Yeah,
and I think that's not the only organization, to your point, right? And so anyway, but thank you. Yes, you.
Yeah, and I would also encourage everybody not to tick boxes. It's like that's never, ultimately, I don't think particularly productive. It's like if you're going to do an external search, it needs to be authentic. And it needs to be fair and equitable, the
Correct.
process.
Yep, that was a concern there. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So, who's responsible for this? This is largely the role of the executive director, your chief executive, who is the person who is establishing culture and leading by example. They need to be somebody who can delegate leadership. And they need to be someone who advocates the value of professional development to the board. So when the board looks at that line item and wants to cut it because the resource development projections, they're trying to create a balanced budget, the ED needs to advocate for that. And that's, the board needs to find the money. It ensures diversity, or can ensure diversity, certainly. It's the responsibility of leadership to make sure that that's in a best practice. It's also your job to hold sometimes a bigger vision for people. I've had staff at times when I've seen someone who was just so smart and so good, but they didn't have a lot of confidence. So what do we do to help somebody, see what we see in them, to see that in themselves? So sometimes it means we're a coach. Sometimes it means we need to find like the right thing for the right person in order to help them grow and fully realize what their talents are and bring those talents to the organization. Again, requiring professional development be included in every budget. That some of your performance evaluations can be targeted in a way to help identify who are some of the potential leaders within the organization. Some of these other things, coaching, mentoring, education. We talked about paying dues in associations, coalitions, and making sure that your internal policies, processes, your job descriptions, detailing responsibilities, including the executive director, that all of these are in place. That anything related to succession planning that or may touch on it is something that is in place, like your emergency succession plan, and that this is the job of the executive director to make sure that those are there. But it's also the board's job. That's a key responsibility of the board is to ensure effective planning, and that is often interpreted just as strategic planning, which is important, but it's also about succession planning and making sure that the board doesn't have to do the emergency succession plan, but they have to require that one's in place. They don't have to do some of the work, but they have to ensure that the work is there. They also have to be mindful of what they're asking of their CEO, and that what they're asking of the CEO is reasonable, given whatever other responsibilities that she or he has. But it's really all about the mission. That's what this is all about. It's about being able to continually reassure the people, the communities that need your services, that those services will continue in an uninterrupted flow, no matter what's happening in the background behind the organization. That's your job, is making sure that the mission can continue. So any other questions about leadership for staff before we get to executive transitions? Okay. Question in the chat. You can just also unmute and shout out if you have a question. But developing staff can create a pipeline within your, yes, absolutely, Marilyn, thank you. Looking internally to see who you're going, where is the talent? Okay, so any questions about staff development before we move into what more than 50% of you were interested in? I know I skimmed through the board development and the staff development to make sure we have enough time here. Okay, so also just want to acknowledge that whenever we're talking about, well, certainly in strategic planning, when we talk about a future state where things are different, we're talking about change. But when we're talking about transitions within the organization, we're talking about change. And it's helpful, I think, to periodically check in with each other, check in with ourselves. So, how do I deal with change, personally? How do I deal with change? But then also, how do we collectively as an organization deal with change? Are there any examples in the past where we've had to change? COVID is an enormous lesson for every organization. Lots of data to be gleaned from how you were affected by and responded to COVID. That's another workshop. But just thinking about how have we navigated change in the past? Have we ever had to do that? And if we are going to do it, how are we going to manage that? Because change is scary. Change is hard. People plan a lot around change, but when they actually have to come to change, it's very, very difficult. So I think it's helpful whenever we're facing challenge to acknowledge the level of challenge we're facing first, and that when we talk about transitions, we are talking about change. So we talked about the emergency succession plan already. So we're going to talk about short-term planned, long-term planned, permanent and unplanned. So let's take a look at the short-term planned, where this may be someone's taking family leave, someone's going on a well-earned sabbatical, somebody has medical issues or bereavement issues, or maybe they're just taking an extended vacation. They've been working for a long time. Maybe they didn't take vacation during COVID. Maybe there wasn't that opportunity, and maybe they're getting burnt out, and you need to think about, do we give this person who's our leader the time they need to rejuvenate and come back to the work refreshed, in order to hold on to them and to ensure that they're operating at their highest and best, that they're not just running on fumes, which after the last couple of years, a lot of folks are in that situation. So in this situation, for a short-term planned CEO departure or absence, that you could have a staff member or a board member who steps in to be the acting executive director. You go to your emergency succession plan for guidance. This is going to detail, that template we'll share with you, will detail what the steps are in a situation like this. If you know it's coming and you can plan, there's an opportunity to do some overlap, perhaps, or do some time to transition from the executive director who is transitioning out for a short period of time with the person who's going to step in. We need to acknowledge the impact of that change on absolutely everybody, because everyone's going to be affected by that, not just at the top. Everybody everywhere is going to be affected. It's a great opportunity for rumor, for misinformation. So being clear with everybody that we have this, there's a plan in place. Our executive director is taking a well-earned sabbatical, and they will be back in a specified period of time. There are relevant policies for this that are in place. There's a compensation plan, and there's a communications plan. And just to touch on compensation for a moment, that what I generally encourage people to do is, if you have a staff member who's stepping in or stepping up to be an acting executive director, that they don't get an increase in salary. What they get perhaps is a bonus at the end, because even with the best of intentions, to give someone more money and then take that money away from them, and they say a difference in their paycheck after having been given extraordinary service, is disheartening, even if it's understandable. So I would encourage people to think about, keep the salary the same. We're only talking about 3 months here, not very long. And then at the end, perhaps a gift or compensation of some sort as a bonus, in gratitude for what they've done. Any questions about short term before we go into longer term, which is very similar, just more time, but still plan? Or give temp raise and leave it slightly high after because they've grown. Oh, that's a great point, Marilyn. Thank you. I'm going to steal that for the next time I do this. I like that. You give them a temporary raise and then leave them at a slightly higher level. Or you could not give them temporary raise when they're doing this, but give them a raise at the end because they've grown rather than a bonus. Give that, amortize it perhaps. Great point. Thank you. Okay. So looking at the longer term planned scenario, this is more than just 3 months. It's 3 to 6 months. And again, it could be sabbatical, could be medical, maybe they're in military, maybe they're in reserve and they're getting called up, but they're going to come back. So in this, again, you have your staff member or board member. Coming back to compensation for a moment, if a board member is stepping in as acting ED for the short-term plan, there should be no expectation of compensation, financial compensation. If you're going to compensate a board member, it gets kind of tricky. Maybe they leave the board, come on as an acting or an interim, and then they go back to the board. But making sure that the roles and responsibilities are clear. If you're going to take somebody internally, let's say you're going to take your CFO or your development director or your program director, and you're going to elevate them to be the acting executive director, for 3 months, they can likely manage to do their regular full-time job and take on additional responsibilities as the acting executive director. But beyond that, or maybe even in that situation, you had case-by-case basis, that you want to make sure that their job that they're primarily responsible for is not suffering. So they may need additional support. Maybe they need to take someone below them up a notch. Maybe they need to bring in just admin support, but something. But think about what does this person need in order to be successful in this role? Those could be short-term hires. They could be consultants. Again, you could go to your emergency plan and see what kind of guidance has been laid out there. Again, you have that opportunity for overlap and transition, acknowledging the impact of change, sitting down with the staff and letting the staff know that, this is going to be a change. This person's going to be responsible. The board has this, but, what are the mechanisms that you're going to put in place to allow staff who are experiencing perhaps unforeseen challenges in this situation to communicate those challenges in a respectful and non-discriminatory, non-punitive way. What are the relevant policies? Again, what's your compensation plan for this? And what's your communication plan? What are you going to tell donors? What are you going to tell clients? What are you going to tell your volunteers? As well as how are you going to communicate with the rest of the staff and the board? So before we move on, any questions about this, about longer term? Okay, great. So now we're going to look at the permanent transition, whether it's planned or unplanned. So unplanned, things happen. People get sick. People win the lottery. There's someone gets hit by a bus, God forbid. I like to think it more as they win the lottery and woo, they get to move on. But still, what does your emergency succession plan tell you to do? If there's been malfeasance of any kind, then you really need to look for the appropriate advice. You need to get legal advice. You need to get an HR expert, maybe consultants, whoever you need to bring in. And you need to let the board and the key staff know that I'm sorry, but so-and-so is not coming into work tomorrow. There has been a situation and they're not going to be here after now. The staff needs to be reassured. This is a big disturbance in the force. This is change at a significant level. So bringing the staff together, having a board member, the board chair, having whoever has been designated as the short-term interim acting ED, even if it's just for a week, that vacuum in leadership is being filled and the board has this in hand. That's very reassuring. It's certainly to donors and clients, volunteers. The board then will form a transition and search committee. I think one of the resources we may have is a charter for what such a committee might look like. There are lots of variations on that. And if we don't have it, I'm blanking on the list of the full list of resources right now, but if we don't, we can provide one of those. This is not necessarily the transition and search committee, don't necessarily have to be the same committee. And the transition search committee doesn't necessarily have to be the same committee that's responsible for onboarding whoever the new executive director turns out to be, or your interim ED, which we'll talk about in a minute too. And that particularly if there's any issue in place relative to any kind of malfeasance, that absolutely nobody comments on this. No staff answers questions to anybody else. You refer, if you get a question, you have a point person, your communications point person. It can be your board chair. It can be the acting executive director, ideally the board chair, I think, in a situation like this with an unplanned departure. People want to see that leadership is in place, leadership is active and aware and has the situation in hand. And that you're going to have communication, you're going to have content, you're going to have a whole plan. So what are you going to say? You want to make sure that certainly whatever is being said, everybody's saying the same thing and that it's appropriate. You want to have a plan that includes the timing of your communications with whom. It may be that one of the first people who know after the staff is convened is that you're calling your major donors and having a one-on-one personal conversation. You're calling the program officers at the various institutional support you're receiving, or government agencies, your contract reps, that those are one-on-one conversations so that they're not hearing about it in the ether and wondering what the heck is going on with this organization where I've invested a significant amount of money. So making sure that all of those things are in place. Any questions about this, about the unplanned, before I go into what the planned scenario looks like? Has anyone ever had this experience? Has anyone ever had to deal with an unplanned departure of a CEO? Yes, Mary, you had your hand up. Anybody else? You're on mute.
So we had a situation a few years ago where our executive director unexpectedly took a position with the governor's staff and gave us, I think, maybe gave us 2 weeks notice. I can't remember. And with the Hartford Foundation's help, we pulled together a search committee, interviewed and hired a consultant. They helped us find an interim director and helped us, develop candidates to interview. It was a scramble at the beginning, but we had good key staff, and they stepped up, and we got ourselves through it.
Great. Great. It's great to hear that you could turn to Hartford for support in this, and that they were right there for you. I work with a lot of nonprofits in a lot of spaces, and a fair number of capacity building nonprofits. But I have to say that from a foundation level, this nonprofit support program that the Hartford Foundation has is probably the most extensive capacity building support program for nonprofits that I've seen. And then I've actually sent people from other foundations to go look at Hartford and to talk to Mara to look at their website. So you guys are very lucky in that in this community you have that and other resources.
Mayor was wonderful. He was just walked us through a lot of it. And I don't think we could have gotten through it without them, because board members don't have all of this at their fingertips. You know, we come from the community and don't necessarily have expertise in any of this.
Right. Because this is something that's a great point, that when you think about it from a board perspective, another key responsibility of any board is to hire and support and evaluate the chief executive. And you may be on a board, you could serve on a board, for 10 years and never have to deal with this issue. But when you do have to deal with it, all of a sudden it's like, whoa. And if you're not prepared, if you don't have that emergency succession plan in place that details how you're going to respond in a situation like that, even with that, there's a lot of scrambling. But it's without that external support, it can get very, very scary and very shaky.
And Frank, I think Anne has her hand raised as well.
Oh, sure. Anne, what's your question? Just so you know, I can see like maybe 5 faces at a time on my screen. So, and there's about 70 of you. So please jump in. Anne, what's your question?
Actually, I was responding to your request for had this happened to anyone.
Oh, yeah. Okay. What happened?
And I think that the other thing is I'm going to take this opportunity to say absolutely the nonprofit support program and Hartford Foundation, bar none, is just a tremendous support and helped and is helping our organization. But our situation is that I was actually the board chair when our founding executive director had to take a medical leave, and I feel very blessed that I was able to step off of the board and into the interim executive director position. We anticipated that would be for a few months. And 1 month after stepping in, our executive director founder passed away. And although you have, that's why when you have up here planned or unplanned, and I have representatives of my board on this call, and they know, as my staff does, that from day one, being ready, whether it's planned or unplanned, is a critical part of what you need to do to make sure that your organization is sustainable. I thank God. I also thank Hartford Foundation for their help, but we're 21 years old now. Wow. That happened 10 years ago. So it is really, really important, everything that's being said right now, because you do not ever know. Right. And the other piece that I wanted to emphasize was around the communication with all of your key stakeholders, especially your funders, because if they don't know what's going on, then they're going to be inclined to want to protect the investment that they've made in your organization. So you do want to make sure that you can present a strong image, or not just image, but can represent to your funders that you are in control. Now I'm talking to the board people that are here, but you want to make sure that you have that. And the other last thing I'll say is that in terms of the consulting fee, we were able to get assistance from the Hartford Foundation to help us with the executive director search. So great. It's really, really key that planned, unplanned. We have this saying, he who lives it knows it, and we've been through it, but you can get through it.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing that. That's great. Okay, so let's look at a planned departure. Unless there were other questions about unplanned. Mayor, I think we're going to move on to the permanent plan. So here's a sequence of events. Ideal. Doesn't always happen exactly the way you want it to, but if it's planned, first things first is the executive director shares their intention to leave with the board chair. And it's one thing to have a conversation, it's another thing to put that in writing. So that's important. You can have a conversation, with the board chair. That's ideally the relationship between the board chair and the ED is one of support and comfort. Best board chair I ever had, we had our check-in calls. We talked maybe once a month. The first question was always, what do you need? I've also had a board chair who wanted to check all the boxes and act like my supervisor. So it's, understanding what the relationship is there is important. And both sides need to be clear about that. But that, it's comfortable enough for an executive director to talk to the board chair and say, hey, I'm thinking about making a transition. It's time, it's whatever, but I need to plan this and I need your help in planning this. So that intention is shared and it's put in writing. And that in that is a time frame for when the intended departure will happen. That goes to the board, and in confidence, the board and the ED together go to the board, announce this, and then the board forms the transition and search committee. Then the board determines what is their process going to be for selecting a new executive director. Are they going to look in-house? Is it going to be an external search? Is it going to be both? Are you going to include potential in-house candidates in the search? And then who is going to conduct the search? Are you going to go to a search firm? Are you going to hire a consultant to help you with this? Are you going to hire a succession planning consultant who's going to come in and help guide you through the entire process? You also want to identify, what are the key questions that need to be answered before and during this transition process? And if you have a strategic plan in place, that can be enormously helpful in being able to say, okay, well, this is our vision for the future. The leadership doesn't change what our vision is for the future. It doesn't necessarily change their vision for the future of the organization. So what are some of the questions we need to ask in order to make sure that we stay on track with that vision for the future? How does that inform what our search is going to be, what we need? One of the things I hear occasionally is people will come to me as a strategic planning consultant versus succession planning consultant and say that, well, our ED's leaving and we need to have a strategic plan. And it's like, well, that's not the time to do strategic planning. You do strategic planning when your leadership is in place and stable. So, strategic planning is not the answer to an emergency situation, this is more emergency than structured. So if you don't have a strategic plan in place, it doesn't mean you still can't vision or have a sense of what you want. But if you're going to do strategic planning, it's helpful to have that new executive director on board and in place and chance to breathe a little bit, figure out where the paper clips are kept, figure out where the bathroom is before you jump right into strategic planning. But you want them involved in the process because they're going to have to own it. Anyway, so some of the questions, what do you need to answer before and during the process? And then again, what's your communication strategy here? What are you telling people about this? What's the timing for communicating? And what's the sequence of announcements? Again, is it the one-on-one calls to the major donors, to the key stakeholders? Where and how and to whom are you communicating? Then let's look at what some of the roles and responsibilities are for people involved in succession planning. But before I move on to that, any questions here about what a planned transition looks like? Or any experiences you've had with a planned transition that you found were helpful, or maybe you had a plan, but you had a hiccup? Anything anybody wants to share if you've had experience here? You can unmute and jump in.
Hi, this is Ann Grabowski with Journey
Hi.
Found. And I haven't had experience with a nonprofit transition, but in the corporate world, I've had several. And, you know, what I've learned is about the need for the robust change management and communication plan, and how the identification of the audiences and the need for the different communications to by audience becomes very important, as
Mhm.
well as the agility of the team, if something isn't working right, to change it and not understand the risk you're taking, but be able to change your direction or change your approach to something becomes very critical through the change or transition.
Mhm. That's a great point. That's a great point, because change on one level, especially change at this level, has a lot of ripple effects. You know, and you may have decided to go in a particular direction because the person in place had a particular gift or talent or connections or whatever, a value that was going to support the movement in a particular direction. And now with that person gone, is that still the direction? You know, or is that something that you need to step back and hit pause on? And you know, one of the things that happens too is let's talk for a minute about interim executive directors, because I'm a big proponent of that, especially if you've had a long-term executive director who's leaving and there's a rush to find somebody to replace that person. And sometimes they want the exact same person. Sometimes they want the exact opposite of that person. Sometimes they're not even really sure what they need until they've had a chance to live in that vacuum for a bit. And some of the things that get exposed when an executive director leaves is you find that maybe they were doing more than one job. This certainly with like smaller organizations with a founder who is wearing multiple hats. You know, they are the development director. They are, as well as the executive director. They're also the CFO. They're also the person who changes the filters on the air conditioners. You know, I mean, they can have all sorts of roles, and maybe you need to replace that person with more than one other person. Actually, we're going to talk about that a bit more. I don't want to get too into it, but an interim executive director can come in and provide the board with an assessment of the current state of the organization that will inform what the search looks like. And one of the benefits of being an interim is that you get to tell the truth. You don't have to be politic. You don't have to worry about longevity in the situation. Generally, an interim's job is to come in, keep the plate spinning, create an experience of emotional safety for the staff and other stakeholders, and help inform what the search is going to look like. And we had a suggestion here. We used an audit from Bob Harris out of Florida. Okay. So the manual, the operations manual, similar to the succession plan. Great. Did someone else have a question? I think there were two people who jumped in at once.
I just wanted to comment that, you know, we had a planned succession with the Women's League, and the Hartford Foundation was very instrumental in helping us with that process. So we were able to, you know, hire a consultant, and the process was, you know, fairly smooth, and able to interview. They did a lot of the filtering of the candidates, you know, and just presented us with candidates with the criteria that we set, and it worked out very well. You know, so we were able to hire a terrific executive director, but I just don't know if we wouldn't have had the success we had without the support of the Hartford Foundation and what
Right.
they provided. So it worked out really well.
Great. All right. Well, thanks for sharing that. And thanks for reinforcing that there's this incredible resource available to everybody in the community.
And Frank, I think Mary, did you have a comment too?
Yes, Mayor, thank you. I've done chaired two search committees for our organization. And I would say to board members who haven't been through that, be prepared to find out that among your board members and any staff you may have on the search committee, they may want to go different directions. You know, we are both a school and a farm, and some people wanted to focus on education. Some people wanted a fundraiser. Some people wanted a farmer. It was, and the first time I chaired it, I don't think we'd done our strategic plan. Our very first executive director was retiring, so we had some time, but people had really different ideas about what they wanted. And part of the job, if you're chairing the search committee, is to figure out how to bring all that together.
Right.
Where you can compromise, where you need to just push, you know. A little bit of the first one was a discussion about what is our vision for our organization. And it led to the need, recognizing the need to do strategic planning after that. Just a comment.
No, that's great. That's great. That's a great point. Thank you. Yeah, because when you're chairing that committee, with a lot of committees, with strategic planning as well as succession planning, that, you know, part of your role is to bring together diverse points of view and to best you can find consensus. And that is not an easy thing to do necessarily. So that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up.
And Frank, if I could just throw in 2 cents on Mary's point.
Yeah, please.
I think that's an excellent point. And I think sometimes that's why it can be really helpful to have an outside consultant facilitate that conversation, because they can help take those differing viewpoints from a neutral perspective and bring them together. And I think it's also a good point in terms of why, you know, we feel like the search is a critical component of the process, but we also think equally important is the sort of pre-assessment and planning that happens with the board and key staff before the search begins. So thank you, Mary, for raising those points.
Great points. Okay, so we're going to look at, you know, who's responsible in this process, and we've talked about some of this. But first of all, for the board, you know, the board needs to understand the full scope of the executive director's role and responsibility. So one of the questions is, you know, in just preparing is like, when was the last time the executive director's job description was updated? Is it up to date? Then does it cover the full scope of their role and responsibilities? And is everybody on the board aware of that? Are they regularly evaluated? You know, there should be an annual evaluation in place for the executive director. Conducted appropriately by the board. It's the board's job to articulate the vision, future vision, and to ensure strategic planning, to ensure that that's in place and that they're not scrambling to do that in the absence of leadership. That should be in place continually. And that it's also their job to onboard the new executive director. One of the things that happens is that you're losing your chief executive, planned, unplanned, whatever, but still huge change, lots of change to deal with, lots of different moving parts to make sure are continuing to operate as they should. And then there's the search, and there's the interviews, and there's the, you know, finally you find somebody who you think is going to be a great candidate, is going to make a great new leader. And they hire this person and think, oh, thank God we're done. But you're not, because that person, that new person needs to be onboarded in a way that is really substantive and supportive. Sometimes I've seen this with a couple of groups where the that search and transition search committee sort of does its job in hiring or recommending for hire the new ED. That's something also to be clear, is that it's the full board that's hiring the ED. That search and transition committee is operating as an extension of the board on behalf of the board, but it's not taking the board's place. It's not usurping its responsibility. So you can delegate the task, but you can't to find the new ED, but you can't delegate the responsibility of hiring that person. That resides with everybody on the board. But anyway, that committee can cease and a new committee can be formed to help on board. And that committee might include people like the chair of the development committee, chair of the program committee, the treasurer, the board chair. You know, who are the people that this person really needs to work with closely? And maybe you set up shorter term goals, maybe like 3-month goals for the new executive director that you can revisit. And then maybe from that, you go to 6-month goals. And then from that, you can move into an annual evaluation. But helping somebody understand the board's expectations periodically through that first year can be really helpful. If you are the person who is leaving, it's about being courageous, you know, and about letting go. Sometimes it's really hard to let go. This is where the courage comes in and the trust, but that, you know, beginning to transition stewardship of key relationships. So if you, as the executive director, is the person with the primary relationship with major donors or certain foundations or government agencies, you know, what's being done before they leave to help transition those relationships, even on an interim basis? You know, is it bringing in the board chair to the major donor conversation? Is it bringing in your director of development, if you have one, to that conversation? You know, who's going to make sure that those relationships continue seamlessly throughout this time of change and transition? And also beginning to prepare the staff for this upcoming change. And one of the things I think it's really important whenever we talk about change is that we prepare ourselves for it to the best we can. But one of the ways to make it a little safer to talk about change is to talk about what's not going to change. You know, what is it that's going to be perpetuated? And that is, our mission is not going to change, and our values, the way in which our values manifest, may change, but the values are not going to change. So what's going to change, what's not going to change? And in reassuring staff and donors and stakeholders that, you know, we have all this change happening at this level, but on this level where mission is unfolding, no change is going to happen there. And the values that we stand for are only going to be stronger, are only going to come into play and get a real chance to manifest. So what's going to change, what's not going to change? The other thing that your current or departing executive director can do is they can inform the search process, but they should not be conducted. This is a personal thing I feel strongly about, that it's the board's responsibility. The board needs to step up for this. They can't go to the ED and say, well, who do you think we should hire? What do you think we need? It's like that person should be part of that conversation, but they should not necessarily be conducting the interviews with the potential candidates. And they may stay on. You may keep them on in a consulting capacity afterwards, particularly if they're retiring. Maybe you're going to pay them for maybe the next 6 months just to have them on call. There's lots of different ways to think about how you structure compensation around departure and what kind of assistance you think the new ED is going to need from the departing ED. Great. So, and then staff. You know, it's an opportunity for staff to step up. You know, sometimes it's like the best thing you can do to support this situation is just do your job. Just keep doing your job the way that you do it and keep us aware of any challenges you have in doing your job because there's an absence in leadership. But basically they need to step up and just, you know, keep things going. And they need to support the onboarding of the new ED. Now, this can be a little challenging, especially if you've had somebody on staff who applied for the job, didn't get the job, and now has to work with the person who did. You know, it's asking a lot of somebody. Let's acknowledge it's asking a lot of somebody to step in and to let go of the fact that they didn't get a job that they applied for, and now they have to work with the person who did. And is that going to be a challenge for them? You know, and this is something I think, if I was, actually this happened to me, came into an organization and found out that there was a guy there who had applied for the job, had been assured by the departing ED that he was probably going to get the job, and didn't get it. And it was not good. Really, it was not a good situation. But one of the first things to do is to acknowledge, look, I understand you applied for the job. It didn't happen. I'm here. How are we going to make this work? Are you okay working with me? It's like, you know, so letting the new ED know that there's this person, that there was this dynamic, so they can address it head on. And also in encouraging someone to apply, making sure that they understand that they are one of a pool of candidates and that the criteria for what you need in a new ED may not be everything that that person has. So, you know, it's tempting to promote the head program officer. But do they have development experience? Do they have advocacy experience? Or you want to promote your CFO? But do they may know the finances in and out, but do they know the program in and out? So what do internal candidates need in order to be viable as a candidate? And being clear about what that job looks like so that they can understand that they're applying for a job where they may be missing some critical skill sets. They do have other things, you know, institutional history, existing relationships, there's benefits. And if you hire somebody from within with skill gaps, then, you know, part of the onboarding is maybe getting them a coach or getting them the opportunity to come up to speed on certain skill sets that they're not particularly strong in. The other thing that I've seen happen, and I encourage folks to think about, is that they hire somebody for the chief executive role, and they hire somebody who was previously number 2 at another organization. Maybe that was a bigger organization, but that they're bringing in someone who was a big number 2, maybe they were the COO, and now they're coming in to be the CEO. But that doesn't mean that they're 100% prepared for that. So again, what are the expectations? What are the short-term goals? What's the education or coaching that person might need in order to really fill out this larger role for themselves? And then you have the others, the interim executive director, which we've talked about, the consultant who can come in and guide this process, is a neutral party. What I've done in succession planning sometimes is the data that I've collected in the succession planning process can be repurposed if it remains fresh, maybe 3 to 6 months later, when you go into strategic planning, a new round or a first round with the new ED. So you can use some of the time and money and data you collected for your search to inform some of your strategic planning as well. And then the funder, we've talked a lot about the role of the funder here and how supportive the funder can be. I once got a succession planning job because the funder said to the client that they wanted to see a robust succession plan. This is before the ED left, but the ED had been in place for 30 years. They had invested a lot of money in this organization. They'd just given them $500,000 for a capital campaign. And the funder said, you know, we're happy to continue to support you, but we want to see that there's a succession plan in place. So there was some urging from the funder. It's a little challenging for the funder. Like generally funders want to be supportive and not directive. They want to be supportive of your plans, not impose their plan on you. So it's a little delicate there, but they can play a lot of different roles in supporting succession planning. So, and speaking of consultants, I want to point out here that one of the benefits you have here with the nonprofit support program is they have this consulting database. And it's the New England Nonprofit Consultant Directory. Here is a link to it. And you can go to this and look for all kinds of consultants. One of the other things that Hartford does the nonprofit support program does is it understands consultants, and I say this as a consultant, that they understand that consultants are a critical part of the nonprofit ecosystem, and that these are not necessarily, a consultant in this list is not necessarily a recommendation from the foundation, but it is somebody that has gotten connected in some way to the foundation and been invited to put their information into the directory. So I don't know that, Mary, do you want to say something about that?
Yeah, just to interject real quick. I agree, Frank, what Frank said about this is not a vetted list, but it's a tool that can be useful to you. And actually, there are many consultants we don't know, because any consultant can actually enter their information in the directory.
Okay.
And our philosophy is we don't want to be in the business of vetting, because we've seen it happen where one organization can absolutely love a consultant and another organization can say, they're just not the right fit for us. So we feel like only you know which consultant's the best fit for you. So any consultant can enter their information. And I'll put in a plug and say, if you know of consultants that you think are good and you've worked with, please encourage them to enter their information, because we want this to be a great and robust tool for everyone.
Great, thank you. And I'm just making a note of the time, and we're running close to the end. So I just really want to quickly run through this, working with the entrenched leader. This is somebody maybe should be going, but they're not. So first things first is understanding why. You know, for a founder or a long-term ED, it might be that there's a loss of identity, a loss of status. There might be financial hardship involved. Maybe they never, you know, have they ever had a 403B? Is there a retirement plan for them? Can they afford to leave? You know, this is not always the case. So, or maybe there's this whole thing of like, this is my baby and it'll fail if I'm not there, or the board will feel that way. And sometimes in a situation like this, you see a board that's built from the founder or the ED's friends. It's a conflict-averse culture. There's this fear that, you know, we can't replace her or him. You know, they're the only person who can do this job. So there's lots of reasons why there may be resistance to the person leaving, but that doesn't mean that it isn't time for them to go, and that the board's job is to start that conversation and to be courageous about it. So I'm going to end here. We only have a minute or two left, but I'm going to stay on to answer questions. Before I do that, I just want to mention some of the resources. So you have this toolkit that's coming, some monographs, a board recruitment matrix, the emergency succession plan, a reflective tool for an executive director to use, a succession planning assessment form for staff. So there's lots of, and more in the resource category. So questions?
Just one question. This is Marion. Just how do we access these resources?
It's on the foundation website.
Okay.
And so you can access them. You will receive a copy of the slide deck, but actually all of it is on the website. Betsy or Monica, is that something you can speak to?
I can dive in, Frank, and just say that, yes,
yes,
Betsy just posted a link to the webpage that has the resources in the chat, and she will also be sending out an email to everybody that registered for the session with the link. So everyone will have the slides and all of the handouts.
Great, thank you. And thank you, Betsy. Any questions?
I do. This is Eileen Hargraves. I'm with the Network Against Domestic Abuse in Enfield, a board member. One of the questions I have is the value of having an assistant director in terms of succession planning. Do you think that that situation typically works? You know, just your thoughts on that, please.
Sure. Actually, the common answer is it depends. So it's not a bad thing, certainly, to have an assistant director. I once had a job as a deputy executive director. but I don't think I was the person to move into the executive director role because my job was primarily focused at the time. This is way back early in my career, the early 90s, where I was really more program focused. But I've seen situations where there is an assistant or a executive director or associate executive director who's in that position with the intention or understanding that they're being groomed to fill that leadership space. That brings us back around to the initial question about ensuring diversity, equity, inclusion, and access in your search process. So are you perpetuating an organizational culture by hiring from within versus doing an external search? But you definitely can think about bringing somebody along to act as the assistant associate executive director with the intention that they would either move into that role or be a strong candidate for that role. And it also gives the existing, it depends on the size and scope of the agency too. So it can give the executive director an opportunity to really focus on some aspects of their job. So maybe the associate executive director is functioning more as like a COO versus a CEO. So it's like, what is that role and what is the job description for that? So I think it depends from one situation to the next. I don't know if that's a clear enough answer, but is it helpful or did it answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay. Okay, we're just a few minutes over time. So Mayor, like I said, I'm happy to stay on to continue answering questions, but just in the interest of being respectful to everybody, I want to make sure that we said we do what we do and do it within the time we said we do it in.
Great, thank